Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the iGaming experience. I'm your host, Sam Bhatti, here in the Zebra Studios in beautiful Podgorica, Montenegro, as I normally am. And today I want to talk about something that keeps coming up more and more in iGaming conversations, especially in the United States. And that is, drumroll please, sweepstakes casinos, and prediction markets. If you found this podcast, you've probably heard names like Polymarket or Kalshi thrown around. You've probably seen headlines. You've probably heard people argue online about whether these things are gambling or are they finance or something in between. Or maybe I'm just in an iGaming bubble because it feels like I hear about these platforms all the time across my different news feeds. These are new emerging platforms that have come on the scene fast, and they can feel confusing very quickly because they're just a bit different. These platforms look a lot like betting. They look a lot like what we're used to, but they don't always behave like traditional iGaming websites. So today, I want to slow this right down and explain what these platforms actually are, why they exist in the first place, and how they differ from traditional iGaming platforms. And toward the end, I'll give you my prediction, no pun intended, clearly labeled as my opinion on whether these platforms survive regulation or whether they get squeezed out. All right, let's start with the big picture, which is why these models exist at all. To understand sweepstakes and prediction markets, you first need to understand a little bit about the US gambling landscape. Just a little bit. The US is very different from Europe or many other parts of the world because gambling regulation is mostly handled state by state, not nationwide. What's legal in New Jersey might not be legal in California. What's allowed in Florida might not be allowed in Massachusetts. That fragmentation creates opportunity. Wherever you have a patchwork of rules instead of a single framework, just human nature, people look for alternative ways to offer similar experiences legally, or at least arguably legally. That's not a value judgment, by the way. That's just how markets work. Sweepstakes casinos and prediction markets are not random innovations, they are direct responses to the way gambling is regulated in the US. Now, let's take them one at a time. I would say sweepstakes casinos are the easiest to understand, so we'll start there because they look most like traditional iGaming sites when you open them. You'll usually see slot style games, casino games, familiar visuals, mechanics, and at first glance, it's just going to look like a regular online casino that you've seen a million times. But structurally, it's different. Instead of the classic deposit money, wager money, withdraw money loop, sweepstakes casinos use a different legal wrapper. They usually operate with virtual currencies and a sweepstake style structure that, in theory, allows participation without requiring a purchase. That's the core argument. This is not gambling, it's a promotional sweepstakes. Now, I'm not here to debate whether that argument is convincing. What matters for you as a newcomer is understanding why this model exists. And it's pretty simple. It exists because it allows casino like experiences to be offered in places where real money online casino is not legal. That's it. Sweepstakes casinos are, I'd say, overwhelmingly a US phenomenon. However, you can find them all over the world. You don't really see them driving global iGaming the way licensed casino platforms do. And even within the US, the availability is inconsistent, to say the least, and changing regularly. So there's a lot of discussion legally about where sweepstakes sit. And again, that's being tackled state by state. Some states tolerate them, others push back, and platforms they adjust or they exit or they just modify how they operate and keep trying to roll within the regulations. The key thing, though, to understand is that sweepstakes casinos live in a space that depends very heavily on interpretation, legal interpretation. And interpretation can change. That fragility, let's call it, matters later on when we talk about the long-term survival or when I give you my opinion on it. Okay. Sweepstakes. That's the basics. We'll be circling back around. But now let's shift gears because prediction markets are very different. And this is where people, I would say, really start to get confused if you're not that familiar with using either of these. And that's because if you're from the iGaming space, you know what you're looking for when you go to a site and what an iGaming site would look like. Prediction markets don't try to look like casinos. They don't present themselves as games. They present themselves as markets. And that difference really is everything. That's the key differentiator here, or at least one of them. So I'll explain what a prediction market really is. At its core, a prediction market is a marketplace where people trade on the outcome of future events. And in fact, I'll put a pause here. In the previous episode, I discussed this briefly with my colleague Josip from Bet Hero, and I would encourage you to check out that podcast because Josip actually gave some great insights on prediction markets and where he thinks they're going, and a few other things on the industry in general and sportsbook. So definitely check that out. We'll be doing more episodes with Josip in the future, but go back and check the previous one. Shout out Josip. All right, but I digress as usual. So on prediction markets, instead of placing a bet with a bookmaker, you're buying or selling contracts that resolve based on what actually happens in the real world. So the simplest way to think about this is imagine there's a question, will X happen? And X can be whatever you want, right? If the market thinks it's very likely that X will happen, the price for yes goes up. So it's a more expensive contract. If people think it's unlikely that X will happen, the price goes down. And because it's a market, like a stock market, you can enter and exit your positions. You're not locked into a single bet. And that's where prediction markets really feel closer to trading than betting. And a few lifetimes ago, during the dot-com bubble, I was an equities trader and trading NASDAQ stocks. So this speaks a lot to my heart and what actually got me initially fired up about the movement of money and working within technology development to facilitate that and make that more interesting. So I was in fintech for a long time before I transitioned over to iGaming. So it's actually quite fun for me to delve into this topic. And in fact, I'm talking about fintech and how similar it is with the trading. So an important point here, I think, just to help you wrap your head around this, is that prediction markets did not come from casinos. Not initially, at least. They came more from finance and from crypto. Yes, there is a crypto root here. And this is something I think people often sense, but maybe they don't fully articulate or think about. But let me just break it down really quickly. The modern wave of prediction markets was super influenced by crypto culture, first of all, not just the crypto mechanics. You've got platforms like Polymarket, which is the big one, that grew out of a crypto ecosystem. They use crypto wallets, they use stable coins, they settled trades on chain. They felt fast, they felt global, and very internet native, let's say. The crypto DNA really shaped how prediction markets currently behave. Even when crypto is no longer visible to the user, and these prediction markets are trying to phase that out a little bit, the philosophy remains. It's markets instead of houses, right? You heard the term, you can't beat the house. Well, in this case, there's no house. It's prices instead of odds. And you've got participants instead of players, right? So these are participants in a market, not players in a game. But here's where it gets interesting. We're now seeing a bit of a split. So on one side, you have crypto native prediction markets trying to become compliant and regulated and all the good stuff. On the other side, you have platforms like Kalshi. So Kalshi, that's Kalshi, which started inside a regulated framework and are, I guess, expanding outward. Kalshi, not like Polymarket, it doesn't feel like a crypto app at all. It feels much more like a trading platform, which again, I mentioned I have a lot of familiarity with. So that line might seem very subtle to a lot of people, but if you're from both spaces or spend time in both spaces, there's a clear distinction, right? So there's no wallet required, there's no blockchain knowledge required, and that's intentional. So when people ask or say, isn't prediction markets a crypto thing? The accurate answer to that is it started that way, but it's evolving into something much broader. And that evolution is what's making traditional iGaming a little bit uncomfortable, right? Why? Why does it make the industry nervous? Well, here's where the tension really comes in. Traditional iGaming in the US is built around, as I said before, state licensing. Operators apply state by state. They pay taxes state by state. They comply with rules and regulations state by state. Prediction markets are often framed under federal oversight instead. That creates a very different strategic picture. If you can offer something that looks like betting on sports outcomes, but you're doing it through an event contract market instead of a sportsbook license, to put it lightly, that raises a lot of eyebrows, a lot of important eyebrows, a lot of wealthy eyebrows, let's say. That's why prediction markets get discussed more as, you would see the term disruptive being used a lot rather than just interesting or a new opportunity. And that's why you've seen some major reactions from inside the industry. Or if you haven't seen it, it doesn't take long to do a little bit of digging and find some major names and some major heavy hitters that are reacting to the availability of these markets. Most notably, the two big dogs in the US market when it comes to sports books, which are FanDuel and DraftKings. They're not even close to the third trailer behind them. They're by far the market leaders in the United States. And I think that this is now a good moment to address something very important, because when I heard it, it actually signaled to me how serious this is and how long-term this could possibly be. So take a note of this. Both FanDuel and DraftKings recently exited the American Gaming Association. It's a big deal. And that wasn't random. Right? The American Gaming Association took a pretty strong stance against prediction markets, particularly around sports-related event contracts. Anything that looked like it's replacing betting on sports. And FanDuel and DraftKings clearly disagreed with that direction, so they left. That's not something that companies of their size in their market position would do lightly. That's a strategic signal, you could say. I mean, it's a big, giant bat signal. It's lighting up the whole iGaming sky when you hear that big, massive players like that are making significant moves towards these prediction markets. It tells you that some of the biggest players in the U.S. sports betting believe prediction markets are not just a fringe idea. They believe this is the lane they want exposure to, even if it creates tension with the traditional iGaming and gambling business world. That alone should tell you that this topic is not going away anytime soon. Okay, let's ground this in reality for a moment. Sweepstakes casinos are mostly US focused, and availability, as I said, varies by state. It's not just on everywhere, and it's not static. Platforms adjust constantly based on the enforcement climate and the interpretation of the law and whether they can actually offer these or not. Prediction markets are more globally minded, I would say, by design, but access, like iGaming, still depends on jurisdiction. Now, Kalshi is broadly accessible in the US, although it's currently being contested in some places. I think just a couple of weeks ago, Massachusetts was a disputed state where there was an injunction filed against them to stop operating. And I believe that at the time of this recording, there's been a stay on that injunction, but still being litigated. Now, Polymarket historically restricted US users for a period. I can't remember how long that period is, but that's my understanding. And is now clearly working towards a regulated US pathway. But they're also remaining accessible in other parts of the world, depending on local rules, so much more accessible. Outside the US, prediction markets sit in very different categories depending on the country. Some see them as financial instruments, some see them as unlicensed gambling, some just block them outright, and I would say most of them, though, fall into the final category, which is they don't know what to do with them yet. The regulation has not quite caught up, and it's just sort of catching the desktops of the politicians and the regulators to try and wrap their head around this and get something in place. And that uncertainty is really part of the story. Now, we're in iGaming, so let's bring this back to iGaming fundamentals, right? A traditional sports book or casino is a house model, right? I referred earlier to the expression, you can't beat the house. Well, the sports book or casino or the operator is the house. They set the odds or the game math, they manage risk, and they earn margins over time, right? Sweepstakes casinos mimic that experience, but as I said before, with a different legal wrapper and more fragility around permission. Whereas prediction markets, and this is an important distinction, I don't know if I really made that clear before, they don't really have a house in the same way. They're much closer to exchanges. So the users trade against each other. The users are the ones that provide the liquidity. The platform itself is just facilitating the exchanging of these contracts, the trading of these contracts, and taking fees. So you're not trying to beat that. You're not trying to beat Kalshi. You're trying to beat the other people that you're predicting against. I nearly said betting, but clearly that's not betting, right? And that difference really does matter, right? It means prediction markets attract a different type of user. You have people who like probabilities, people who like being right, people who think in terms of markets instead of entertainment. And that's why prediction markets don't automatically replace sports books. They overlap for sure in some areas, especially on sports outcomes, but they're not the same product psychologically, right? Even with sports books offering cash out, there is some level where you're not fully locked in, but clearly not the same as trading, where you can get in, you can, and then get out with small gains or small losses, as opposed to all or nothing. All right, so let's land this plane now. Do these models last? Right. Here's my opinion, which is clearly, everyone look, clearly labeled as only my opinion. I am not a compliance expert or a gambling legal mind based in the United States. So, just my opinion here. I think that sweepstakes casinos, as they exist today, which is broadly available, casino-like, and just very lightly constrained, are likely to get squeezed over time. So, not wiped out, just narrowed. There'll be fewer states where they'll be available, probably some more restrictions, some more conservative implementations, and maybe a push towards some type of licensing models where possible. You can definitely see that coming. As I said before, sweepstakes rely heavily on interpretation, and while some opinions are in, it's still being discussed, and as we said, those interpretations can change. Prediction markets, on the other hand, I think are here to stay, but not in the free-for-all sort of form that they are now. I expect prediction markets to become a permanent category within iGaming, and just maybe a standalone business that or category of business that operates. And I would say that applies especially to those that can operate under clear regulatory frameworks. Right? There are some, their prediction markets are in the prediction game, and it's not that difficult to try and think of what regulations might eventually be applied to them. So I think that the prediction markets that are looking at that now and planning for the future will have a place in the very long term. Right. So I expect clearer lines to be drawn, particularly around sports. I think sports is going to be the big one. When it comes to politics and entertainment and the Oscars and whatnot, that might be less scrutinized. But sports, it's different. So, in other words, right, there will be survival through structure. So the as I said, the ones that are forward thinking and build this into their structure shouldn't have any issue carrying on in their own right or integrating with some of the bigger brands in iGaming. Right, the platforms that can handle scrutiny and compliance and long-term permission will survive. Right, the ones that are relying on ambiguity or the current interpretation ever changing, they might not. So that would be really my prediction on where these things are going to be in the future. And I think that's it. I think I've gotten through most of my notes here. I'll give you a final thought. I would say if you're new to iGaming, don't get pulled into big arguments or shouting matches around this topic. This is kind of an intermediate topic. It's something that if you're brand new and you know a lot about this, it'll impress people. They'll be able to tell that you're dialed in to the industry, but a lot of the dust is still being settled, so I wouldn't go in with strong opinions either way. So instead, do what you're doing now, which is doing some research. Understand the models. Understand the platforms. If you can, right, I always advise this, make accounts on some of these platforms and play around a little bit. Just get your thoughts on how appealing they are or aren't, right? How did it feel to you? And are you Are you someone that likes the idea of being able to trade and have bragging rights over other people for picking the right contracts, or do you just like placing a bet and set it and forget it, and we'll see what happens? Give it a go. So, just to tighten it all up here, in a nutshell, I'll just give you a quick recap, I guess. Traditional iGaming is licensed gambling with deep product ecosystems, lots of third parties, and all the different compliance and regulatory hoops that need to be jumped through. Sweepstakes, on the other hand, is a promotional framework that is, I would say, imitates casino experiences and mostly found in the US. Tolerance is shifting on those things. Prediction markets are event-based markets that allow users to trade contracts based on their prediction of future outcomes. A super boring way to say it, but I hope that that's clear. If you understand that, you're already ahead of most people talking about this online. And that's the extent of my knowledge. There may be a part 2 on this, or there are 3 and a 4, because we've not heard the last of prediction markets for sure, and sweepstakes are still a pretty hot topic. So if there's more on this or some major movement, then we'll definitely do another episode and keep you informed. In the meantime, I'll say thanks for listening to the iGaming experience. And shout out to a lot of the international listeners. We spoke a lot about the US here. I've noticed that there's a lot more states that are lighting up on my analytics map now, particularly in New Jersey, which is where most of my family lives, in New York and New Jersey. So shout out to all my folks there in New Jersey checking out the pod. A lot of people in California. And it's just very international. I think we've got our first listeners in Estonia recently, quite a few in Malta, quite a few in the United Kingdom. So shout out to all you that are checking out the iGaming experience and trying to level up. I appreciate you. Good luck with your journey. I'm Sam Bhatti here in the Zebra Studios in stunning Podgorica, Montenegro, and I will catch you in the next episode. Cheers.